All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Good evening, everybody. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs and Visitor Services Coordinator at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our discussion of the film Lincoln and Douglas, Touring Illinois in Turbulent Times. This program is part of our 14th annual Lincoln Lecture Series. And I would also especially like to thank tonight's guest, Graham Peck, Nathan Peck, and Sunshine Clemons joining us tonight to present our film discussion, and we will meet them in just a few moments. Before we get into tonight's program, I did want to go over a few housekeeping items. Thank some folks. Also, let you know what's coming up at the Museum of the Grand Prairie and the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. So first and foremost, please, if you can, let us know where you're watching from by writing down in the comment section below where you are tuning in from tonight. Kathleen has already written in that she is tuning in from Canton, so thank you so much, Kathleen, for tuning in. Thank you to everybody out there watching this program live with us tonight. So again, write your location down in the comment section if you wouldn't mind. A little bit about us at the Museum of the Grand Prairie. Museum of the Grand Prairie opened originally as the Early American Museum in 1968, and our current mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the cultural and natural history of Champaign County and East Central Illinois for all generations. And the museum is part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, a collection of 7 forest preserves, 2 educational facilities, including our museum, as well as the Homer Lake Interpretive Center, a golf course, a multi-purpose rail trail, and so much more here in Champaign County. Also, we would love to hear from you. We're looking for some inputs in order to improve our future programs. So after tonight's program, I'm dropping a link to a short survey that we'd love for you all to complete. Give us some feedback on tonight's program. Let us know what you thought. Help us improve future programming. Give us suggestions for programs you would like to see us put on in the future. Again, I just dropped that link to that short 5-ish minute survey for you to complete after tonight's program. Also, I wanted to thank Urbana Public Television and their CU Wise program for broadcasting this documentary multiple times this week, leading up to tonight's program on this local television station, as well as streaming the broadcast live on their website, streaming around the world. Hope you had an opportunity to view the film tonight before tonight's program. If not, that's okay. Graham and Nathan will fill you in on other opportunities to view the film later on, and we'll also be discussing general topics that are associated with the film, but don't necessarily require you to have viewed the film in advance. I think we'll have a general conversation tonight that all folks can enjoy for tonight's program. A few programs coming up in the near future I want to let you know about. Thursday, November 4th, 1 week from tonight, we'll be doing another virtual presentation live on our museum's Facebook and YouTube pages, just like this program is streaming there tonight. At 7 o'clock, program is titled Part of the Community, East Frisian Oral History in Champaign County. In the 1990s, the Museum of the Grand Prairie conducted an extensive oral history project documenting the history of East Frisians in Champaign County. There's a large portion of East Frisians that came to Champaign County and settled in the northeastern portion, and this unique oral history project will be detailed in this particular program. Our curator, Mark Hansen, will talk all about the project, its recent digitization, as well as a recent exhibit that he created that will be traveling the county, as well as debuting on our website here pretty soon. So again, that program is on Thursday, November 4th, live on our Facebook and YouTube pages at 7 o'clock. On Saturday, November 6th, at the museum, we'll be hosting an in-person program. It's our annual Explore Archaeology Open House, where we partner with the East Central Illinois Archaeological Society and the Illinois State Archaeological Survey to provide a number of artifact displays, as well as hands-on activities associated with artifacts and the wonderful field of archaeology. So if you're interested in archaeology, if you're interested in historical artifacts, come out to this program in person at the Museum of the Grand Prairie on Saturday, November 6th from 1 to 4 p.m. And much like we do every day when the museum is open, we will be abiding by current public health standards concerning COVID-19. So masks will be required. Folks will be required to be distanced. We'll have a number of other protocols in place. So again, join us for that Explore Archaeology Open House in person on Saturday, November 6th from 1 to 4 p.m. Coming up on Thursday, November 18th, our final program in our annual Lincoln Lecture Series will take place again on our Facebook and YouTube pages at 7 o'clock. The program is titled Knowing Him by Heart, African Americans on Abraham Lincoln. Professor Matthew Norman of the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash will discuss the complex diversity of African American thoughts and feelings on Abraham Lincoln from the 1860s to the 1960s. So again, join us for that program, our final program in this year's Lincoln Lecture Series on Thursday, November 18th at 7 o'clock. For more info about what we're doing at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, our programs and our events, feel free to check us out on social media, or you can visit museumofthegrandprairie.org. Again, let us know where you're watching from. Write your location down in the comments section. Rob is tuning in from Champaign. Kathy is tuning in from Flanagan. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight, letting us know where you're watching from. Also, if you have any questions during the course of the program, please write those down in the comment section below. We encourage you to join us on the conversation tonight. So again, write your questions down below in the comment section, and we'll address those as best we can. I'll be moderating those comments and those questions in the comment section throughout the program. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists for tonight. So again, I wanted to thank them all for joining us. Three lovely panelists for our conversation tonight. So first, I'm going to bring on Graham. Graham, can you see me? Can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Yeah. So Graham Peck. Graham is the Wepner Distinguished Professor of Lincoln Studies at the University of Illinois-Springfield and affiliated faculty at the UIS Center for Lincoln Studies. He is the author of Making an Anti-Slavery Nation, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle Over Freedom. And in addition to putting together the film for tonight's discussion, Graham was the writer, director, and producer of Stephen A. Douglas and the Fate of the American Democracy. Graham co-directed and co-produced the film at the center of tonight's discussion, Lincoln and Douglas, Touring Illinois in Turbulent Times. So thank you so much, Graham, for being with us tonight. Then we'll bring on Nathan. Nathan, are you there? Can you see us? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So Nathan is an associate professor in the art and design department at Xavier University in Chicago. He's also a sculptor, painter, and video artist. He's an active collaborator and pursues projects that intersect with history, music, religion, and the sciences. Alongside Graham, Nathan co-directed and co-produced tonight's film. And our third panelist is Sunshine Clemons. Let's bring on Sunshine. Sunshine, can you see us? Can you hear us?
I can see and hear you. Thank you.
All right. So Sunshine Clemons is a lifelong community advocate who has spent most of her life in Springfield, Illinois, since moving from East St. Louis at an early age. Sunshine co-founded the local Black Lives Matter SPI chapter in Springfield, Illinois with Karan Reedus. They established BLM SPI, galvanized by the hurt and anger that the murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile incited. These tragic events inspired them to lead a rally that eventually led to the creation of the local chapter, with the goal of making a concentrated effort here in Springfield to implement changes to local law enforcement, the community at large, and the day-to-day lives of Black people in the city of Springfield. Sunshine's main objective is to help create a better relationship between the local community and those who are supposed to support them, whether it be law enforcement, the judicial system, elected officials, business owners, or everyday citizens who can help implement real and lasting change. Sunshine is also a founding member of Springfield Call to Action, a coalition of organizations committed to justice, including racial, religious, gender, economic, social, and environmental. Sunshine was a contributor to the film, and pieces from her interview with Graham and Nathan are included in the film. So again, thank you all for joining us for tonight's program. Really happy to have you with us. So is everybody doing okay tonight?
We're good.
Doing all right.
Cool. All right. So just to get the conversation going, I have some questions that I'll start with. But again, those of you watching out there, feel free to ask any questions about the film. Hopefully you had an opportunity to see it. If not, as I mentioned, talk about some opportunities to view it later outside of this program. And then also there's a lot of great historical and present day topics that we'll be discussing tonight. So we'll start with just the general motivation to produce the film. So would you guys mind sharing where that came from? What motivated you to make the film or contribute to it? And could you describe the process that you took to produce it?
Well, let me start. This is one of those projects that I love, where it started in one direction and it landed in a totally different direction. And most of my favorite projects really do that. Um, me and Graham had collaborated on a previous film. We've worked together for several years at the same university, and it was a matter of time before it was time to set out on another film project. And initially, I wanted to sort of mix some of our shared interest in Abraham Lincoln, but also my interest in theater and performance more broadly, and to try to sort of engage with Lincoln and Douglas presenters, impersonators, people who really sort of do this as a living or do this as sort of a personal calling, and really try to sort of do a little bit of sort of in front of stage, backstage sort of thing. Just get to know those people. By strange chance, that film was interrupted by world events, and suddenly it was locked down, and suddenly the film was canceled, and we were going to just have to wait a year, until we got on the phone one night and decided, well, perhaps there's a different film that's beginning to form. And that was the beginning of looking at this. Perhaps, one of the things that can come with a world-changing event like the pandemic is that the world looks a certain way. And you could then put history, these events of the 1850s and 1860s into 2020. If you suddenly, saw people wearing masks, you saw, stores closed, you saw this sort of like empty streets. If we were able to capture the story in this time, it might put it in this time. Even in the future, you could look back at this film and know that it was made in 2020. Now, fast forward a little bit further, and all of a sudden, as the events of the murder of Floyd, and all of a sudden there was protests in the street, all of a sudden we were in a situation where there was an additional marker of this particular time, that being civil unrest and the sort of continuation of some of the same issues of debate that were going on all the way back to the time of Lincoln and Douglas. And we're like, all right, now it sort of feels like if we don't do it, it would be sort of a bit of a travesty. So we began looking at, how could we go to these locations and learn, and not go to these locations and tell anybody what to think, but to go to these locations and try to ask questions and figure out for ourselves what we think, and figure out for ourselves what we think is the next step. So it was sort of a very evolving process, but for the fact that I think that Graham and I had a desire to try to make something in 2020 that was about 2020 as much as about the 1860s.
Yeah, you can feel that in the film, feeling the changes that are, taking place, and, such a turbulent time, in 2020, and, that we're still experiencing here in 2021 as well, ongoing and continuing. The film is Lincoln and Douglas. At the center, we're looking at, the commemoration of these Lincoln-Douglas debates and a number of other issues. So I wondered, just for the general viewer out there who maybe, for example, not know much about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I was wondering if Graham, could you briefly, describe for the viewers, the Lincoln-Douglas debates and what makes these debates historically significant?
Sure. So first of all, the two men were competing for a United States Senate seat from Illinois. So it was a political race, and therefore they ended up traveling the state in order to recruit voters. The debates were much more important than your average run-of-the-mill Senate race, however, because 2 years previously, in 1856, the Republican Party had burst into view with a vengeance and had essentially dominated almost all of the northern states. And this mattered because it was an anti-slavery party, particularly an anti-slavery extension party, but behind that was a hostility to slavery and a desire to see it die. And so Illinois was one of the northern states that had not voted for the Republican Party. It was a key swing state. So, and it was led by Stephen Douglas, who was the preeminent northern politician of the day and the leading Democratic politician of the day. So for Douglas's seat to be up and contested by a Republican was something that garnered national attention. And what made it even more interesting and unusual was that normally Senate seats were decided by state legislatures, they were not decided by men going out and campaigning. That was true for many elections, most notably for House of Representative seats and for state legislative seats, but not for U.S. Senate seats. Really, they were decided in January after the state legislative races had been run, and then those men gathered, the new legislature gathered and selected a senator. The only reason that didn't happen in this case, or at least in that way, was that Lincoln was selected at the Republican State Convention as the first and only choice of the Illinois Republican Party. There's a backstory to that we don't need to go into, but this was very unusual. So in other words, every Republican state legislator was guaranteed to vote for Abraham Lincoln and only Abraham Lincoln in the state legislature should they be elected. And that meant that Lincoln could then go to Douglas and say, I want to debate you in public during the entire campaign season because I am your opponent, which normally never was the case. Any Republican could have been elected under normal circumstances, but not in this one. So under those circumstances, Douglas didn't want to duck the debates. And so they had this planned out series of debates. And that was so unusual that national reporters came to Illinois. They took down the debates and published them in the leading partisan newspapers, which is why we have the record today. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a record. This was atypical. So that really is the central political backstory with one added important element, and that is the debates were primarily over slavery, precisely because slavery was the fundamental issue by the late 1850s in national politics, and certainly it was the cutting issue between the Republican and Democratic parties. So even though you'd think that these two sort of local politicians, so to speak, would be speaking about Illinois issues, practically speaking, they were really focused on national issues, although of course they were appealing to a Illinois base.
Yeah, so we've got a large, a pretty serious political battle at center stage across the entire nation at a pretty contentious time, pretty historically significant set of debates stretching across the entire state. So thank you for that, Graham, providing that background. Sunshine. So I was curious. I saw a previous program where you mentioned that the interview that you conducted with Graham and Nathan, you guys had an interview that lasted several hours. And of course, the film is, about 45, 46, 47 minutes. Of course, the whole interview didn't make it in there. But I was curious, Sunshine, how did you get involved? Did you reach out to Graham and Nathan first? Did they reach out to you? How did that conversation get going? And I was curious, why be involved with a film about Lincoln and Douglas and the debates, and how does that relate to current times and the work that you're so passionate about?
Interesting question. They actually reached out to me. Graham reached out. I believe he got my information from one of the local aldermen in town that I deal with regularly. I was not aware that the film was even in the works, so they reached out to me, and I think. And one thing I appreciate the fact that they were making this film, and as the story began to change on a national level, I appreciate their flexibility in allowing that to alter what they were creating at that time, because I could see, someone having the mindset of, well, this was my plan. I'm going to stick with this and continuing that. So I do want to go on record as saying I appreciate that the flexibility that they offered up and allowing the film to kind of navigate itself, and not sticking to a set course that they, I'm sure initially had in mind. But they did reach out to me, asked if I would be interested in joining the discussion that they were having, because there was becoming a local and national outcry to remove statues, and Stephen Douglas was one of them, and that was something that we were dealing with here on a local level in our city. And it was an interesting, unique opportunity. I've never been called to ask to be part of a documentary before, and I thought that it would be a good opportunity to kind of get on record as part of history what was happening in the moment, and kind of give our insight on why we felt that removing statues of people like Stephen Douglas is something that is worth having a serious conversation around, and following through with the decision to do that.
And I think that there's also just the fact that, there's two of us, me and Graham, driving around, sort of shooting the film in real time. That was something that was really an essential part of this. No matter where the film went, it was going to be shot in real time, partly because we're both full-time professors. Like, we have other jobs, and we had a chunk of time carved out to go and do this project. And so it was really, we're going to shoot during the day, we're going to edit in the evening, and then we knew what the first chapter looked like. And then we would shoot the next day and edit in the evening, and now we knew what chapter 2 looked like. And as we were going along, literally the news was changing and the story was changing, and then therefore the film had to change. And the opportunity for the two of us, as we're sitting and trying to work out in our own minds sort of how we felt about, the sort of continuing legacy of Lincoln and Douglas, the continuing legacy of some of these same debates over race and same debates over who has, privilege to have their story told, et cetera. Like, these same stories were sort of, continuing. The question was like, are me and Graham the only two people whose voices should really be heard here, besides these sort of Lincoln and Douglas representatives, that were speaking their words and speaking the actual words that were said in the debates in the 1850s, translated or set over top of 2020, which was making a lot of sense. But we needed to expand the voices that we were really using in this to try to get other perspectives, frankly. And I think that because the news and the story that was in I think in the newspaper that Graham had read regarding Springfield's statue of Douglas and Sunshine's work on and working with the folks on that particular project, and especially just the fact that she had this perspective that we felt could really enhance our film, then it was sort of a logical extension to sort of say, if you're free and you can add another point of view, because again, like, me and Graham are often very different in our perspectives, but one of the funnest things about having somebody different than you in a lot of ways is the opportunity to bounce ideas, right? And so the more people that you can bounce ideas off of, the wider your perspective can become if you're open to listening to other people, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate all the perspectives you brought in. The first person interpreters and Sunshine, Catherine Harris, as well. We've worked with Catherine Harris. She's been Elizabeth Keckley and Harriet Tubman numerous times at our museum. So really appreciated all the voices. And yeah, you mentioned it's the changes throughout the film. You shot it in real time. You're talking about these historical moments, in our country's history, and we're living through another very historically significant moment, in 2020, and as the pandemic and racial injustices continue to go on in the United States, we're still living through these historical moments. So talking about a historical moment, 150-ish years ago, while we're still living one in real time, and you can see that in the film, as it changes. I thought that was really cool. I really appreciated that.
I mean, and not to mention, there was also like a pretty major presidential election going on at the same time. I mean, there was a lot happening in the news, and there was a lot happening in our minds. And to say that I was anxious working on this film would be an incredible understatement for a variety of reasons. I mean, just being out of my little house and my little shell, just like there was a lot of reasons why I was uncomfortable. And I also don't normally engage in political discussions publicly. You know what I mean? I really don't. But I think that at the same time, I think it's a thing that I've always been interested in, and I've really, one of the reasons that I enjoy working with Graham in general is that our conversations tend to cover a wide range of things, from history to art to politics to a variety of other things, academic.
Well, I'm sure he was also anxious because he was virtually going without sleep, because we bought a computer so that we could edit on the road, but we didn't bring another computer. And so we realized we had a problem, and that was only one person could edit, and that was him. So I would drive around and he was bleary-eyed and utterly exhausted and trembling and getting his coffee. So that probably spurred more anxiety.
There was also, if you don't remember, in case you don't recall, there was also supposed to be a cameraman. There's also supposed to be a sound
I recall very well, because I had to beg Nathan to finish the film because the cameraman quit the day before because of COVID. So Yeah, it was brutal. So the film was only barely made. I think actually Nathan's wife deserves most of the credit because
She's
on
like,
the backside she was encouraging him to go out and make it. So we owe Pay an enormous thanks because I didn't have enough umph to get him to do it myself.
That's why we need all of these various perspectives and all these voices. You see, they all have their little power.
Well, for such a small crew, very well done. Really appreciate it. Talking about, Nathan, you mentioned that you and Graham, have worked together previously, and you may have touched on this already a little bit, but how is this documentary similar to previous films you guys have worked on? How is it different?
Well, I'll answer that in brief. For the one film I've worked on, he's had more experience with video. The first film that I developed, and he came on later in the project to really improve it, but it was a Ken Burns style film that had a lot of static images that we were moving in the way that Ken Burns moved them. And it had a lot of narration, and it had studio interviews of historians. So that was really the combination of 5 different historians, a really good narrator, and hundreds of archival caliber images. So in that way, it was a very cool, in some ways more polished film than this one. But it was a revelation to me to go on site and to try and do filming, which has a whole series of different challenges, which was why Nathan ended up doing so much after the person we were planning on being the second camera guy quit. I said, Nathan, I'll step in and do that. And he's like, you don't understand. Like, that's not going to work. You're just going to have to hold the cord. Like, I'm going to have to do everything. And that's the way it's going to go down. I can't train you that fast. So I learned a lot in this process. And I'll turn it over to him to tell you more.
Well, he did learn a lot, and in fact, he's a very good student of cinematography. He's been picking up a little bit as we've been going along. But I think this is very, very different than the type of things that I generally do. In that, I came up as much more of a video artist, the flashy pictures at the nightclubs, like VJ along with the DJ sort of thing. Like that's my super happy place when I first got to Chicago specifically. But I teach basically video making, multimedia, that sort of stuff at my university. Sort of walk students through using the tools and the techniques of video editing, film editing, that sort of thing, digital storytelling. But actually, it was a couple of years back when we had an art historian leave our university, and I needed to put together a quick art history class. And not being an art historian, I decided to really lean heavily on documentaries and really sort of consume as many art history documentaries as I possibly could in one summer, that I really realized how much I really enjoy that form. Not always necessarily a straight documentary, but the idea of telling history with moving pictures, whether it's using reenactors or whether it's using sort of like pan and scan images, that sort of thing, or if it's just sort of having a really rich storyteller sort of weave a history for you, right? There's something about consuming history that way that really turned me on to really getting much more back into history than I ever was before, specifically art history at the time. But Graham and I actually took on a challenge of co-teaching a class in creative documentary filmmaking, historical documentary filmmaking. I think my class was called creative documentary. His was called historical documentary. But the students had to sign up for both of them. They took this class together, and they made a documentary about the foundresses of our institution. And during that process, we really got to figure out Graham's magic skill of telling true stories and my magic skill of telling interesting stories and trying to merge the two together. Because my storytelling tradition growing up was you tell the most interesting story regardless of how true it was. Like sitting around our table growing up, it was like you can spin a tall tale as long as it's an interesting story, versus obviously a lot of history relies heavily on understanding a variety of versions of the truth and trying to make sense out of them, right?
Yeah, I think there's, as a student of history, I really have a great appreciation for the really great storytellers. We had this discussion in one of my classes, one of my master's classes, about is history more science or is history more art? And I think that the argument can certainly be made that there is a great value in the storytelling ability of history and and treating it as an art as well because it can greatly impact how your message is received. You can do a great job of uncovering history and working to tell it and to make your arguments, but if it's not being received and accepted as well, maybe through your storytelling abilities, as an art form, then maybe that's something to work on as well. So I appreciate that. And
leaning in a little bit to some of the territory that Graham tends to cover, I think that all of these things are sort of part of the historical landscape, whether it's the history books or it be the sort of documentaries that exist, but also the statues that exist out in the world, murals on the wall. As we were traveling around, we collected a lot of this sort of like landmark artworks, that were set up to commemorate locations where these historic events took place. And then, of course, we also saw several places where there was just monuments, right? And then in other situations, there were places where there were sort of like, heroic sort of artworks of one sort or another that are designed. And each of them has a different sort of role, right, in community. And I think that, to Sunshine's point in the film, just because, we put this thing into this place and this thing might have been something that somebody respected at a certain time. I mean, it doesn't mean that we have to walk up into our public space and see, a particular statue that represents something that we don't agree with, because again, history is something that is, to a certain degree controlled by power and on some level, not exclusively, but on some level, like the official stories that are told, you know what I mean? In terms of some representations of history, those public representations, especially, somebody gets to decide what is on the wall and what is on the pedestal, and somebody else doesn't necessarily have the same level of control sometimes.
Yeah, that leads me into a question I was going to ask. But before I do that, I just want to remind the viewers out there, if you have any questions, comments for our panelists, feel free to write those in the comment section. Would love to have you engage in the conversation as well. So building on, these monuments and where they are, of course, the subject of the film, you're looking at, not only standing fixed monuments and memorials, but you also look at, these first-person interpreters and the type of memorialization and commemoration that they're putting on. So, just throwing this out to, everybody in the group, looking at context, context is everything. And Nathan, you were talking about it a little bit there, but maybe we can dig a little deeper here. How is place and location of memorials and monuments, significant? Maybe you can have an artwork in your own private home, but how is having that in one place different than compared to seeing, artwork in, maybe a public park or, maybe on the grounds of the Illinois State Capitol, even?
I'll jump in on that first, and just say that the way that I look at it is, what someone has in their home, if that is something that they, feel passionate about, that is their personal space. They can do what they like with that. When it comes to things that are in public spaces, and especially public spaces that are supposed to be open to all, like our state capitol building, it is, commonly referred to as the People's House, public parks and things like that, especially where the upkeep involves public funds that are paid through taxpayer dollars, etc. That is, to me, a completely different situation than having something in someone's personal home, or even another public space such as a museum. If there's a Stephen Douglas statue at a museum that is talking about his role in history and gives true and transparent good and bad of what was done, that to me, I don't have an issue with. There's even places, I think it was addressed in the documentary. There is a marker with Stephen, or a statue of Lincoln and Douglas in, I can't remember the city, but it is talking about a specific act in history that happened. It's not a statue to say these are men that, we're idolizing. This is a moment in history. This was a specific statue to a debate that happened here that is a significant part of history. That's even different to me. But just having statues that are there to say this is a person from our history that we recognize and honor, and they have a prominent place in the Capitol building or whatever Supreme Court building, etc. That is where I have the issue, because there is significant in difference in where these items are placed and what that means and why they're there.
Yeah. And like things like battlefield memorials, I mean, it makes sense for them to be in the location of the battle, right? Situations where you've got a representation of a figure in a place where something took place. That's the most appropriate time and place for that sort of situation. I think that as soon as you start thinking about the scale of a project, as soon as you start thinking about the permanence of a project, you start thinking of a very different sort of relationship between the monument and the location, right? I think that, Stone Mountain in Georgia, where you've got these giant Confederate soldiers, there's the scale and the permanence of that have a different relationship than something that is temporary or something that could be put up or taken down. The same with Mount Rushmore in the sacred Black Hills of South Dakota, right? Where it's just like, this is something that's very permanent in a place that means a lot to Americans, but also means a lot to, Native American tribes, and it's a scale and permanence issue. That's always something that, it's something that has to be discussed and has to be considered. Now, in my mind, the larger the scale and the more permanent something is, the more the discussion should really take place with as many people as possible, versus those things that are more smaller and more potentially temporary. In which case, I think that in many cases, public art should have a timeline where you discuss it, and then it's going to be discussed again some point down the line, so that there is the opportunity for it to be considered and to be reconsidered.
Yeah, Graham, we lost you there for a second, but good to see you back.
Glad to be back. You all turned into swirling things like this, and I thought at that point I had to exit and try and re-enter. So
okay.
glad I made it.
Yeah, we're here now. So picking up on that, and then at the end of the film, as we're talking, we talked about earlier, you guys producing a film through all of these historical moments. At the very end of the film, you're talking about the removal, Sunshine talking about, removing the statue of Stephen Douglas from the Capitol. And then, of course, it eventually did come down, there at the very end of the production there. So it's interesting, as I mentioned before, really cool just to see such these historical moments happening throughout the film, and you guys were able to capture that and, present that happening there.
Go ahead. Sunshine.
I was just going to say, I don't think we didn't talk about this in the documentary at all, but in addition to the statue being removed, Douglas Park here in Springfield, the name was changed for that as well. So that is now Duncan Park. So that's another step that was accomplished in that a little bit of a later time frame as well. So I appreciate our Springfield Park District for having that conversation, and for the way that they did it. They opened the voting process up to the community, took in all the suggestions, of name possibilities that were offered, and then they, decided amongst themselves on what it would be. But I feel like that's a good way to kind of correct and rectify. And I appreciate Nathan's point where he said, have that conversation and then have it again later, because at one point, people that we have statues up right now that we may not be aware of, in 50 years, they may need to come down as well. So it's not a conversation that you just have and then it's over. It's always going to be changing. And as was pointed out in the documentary, it's not changing history. It does change the landscape of history, but that is okay. Sometimes that is something that needs to happen, and we need to have flexibility in what we're putting up and honoring, and realizing that we may be making a mistake, and in the future we may have clearer vision and want to change that, and that's okay.
Yeah, not only we're talking about place and location and context being significant, but also time is the era is significant to the interpretation of the piece as well. So thanks for bringing that up, Sunshine. And on the Duncan Park, the namesake for Duncan Park, can you tell us a little bit more about Duncan Park? Does any of you know the backstory behind the namesake for Duncan Park?
I can say a little, but I will offer it up to the historian first, who will probably know a lot more than I would. So if anybody else wants to jump in first, that's fine.
I think he was a World War I colonel, wasn't he? Otis Duncan?
He was. He was also his home was vandalized and raided during the 1908 race riot here in Springfield that kicked off the creation of the NAACP here in town. And he was also, I don't remember what the relation was, but I know that he was related to the gentleman that was Abraham Lincoln's barber.
Okay.
So, but I don't remember if they were cousins or what. I don't remember how they were related, but I do know that they were a family.
Okay.
Yeah. In Chicago, I basically every couple of years I go to this big music festival called Riot Fest that's taken place in Douglas Park for several years. And Douglas Park, this most recent T-shirt has one extra S on it for Frederick Douglass. It's been renamed to him. But for years, there was actually a group of school teachers that were calling for the change of the name of this park. And actually, there was a couple of women who were going in late in the afternoon and adding little S's to all of the signs, turning them all from Douglas to Douglas, and from Stephen Douglas to Frederick Douglass for about 5 or 6 years before it was officially changed. But again, also in that same summer of 2020, that park was officially changed from Stephen A. Douglas Park to Frederick Douglass Park.
That was initially the first suggestion for our Douglas Park, was to name it for Frederick Douglass as well. But then the park district decided to open it up and take suggestions, and it was voted on to go to become Duncan Park. And there is a lodge here in Springfield dedicated to the honor of Otis Duncan. So that was, I think, a big honor for them as well. So, but that was initially the idea stemmed from changing it from Douglas to Douglas here as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's a cool way to go about it. If there's call from the public, from the people to, maybe change something that is supposed to be for the people, you get the input from the people in order to make that change. So
I thought that was great. And I also appreciated the fact that Duncan is local. So now this park is named after someone here. Our Black Lives Matter chapter, we suggested a name as well. We suggested Eva Monroe, who was someone local. We just thought the idea of having one of our parks here named after a local hero was, you just couldn't beat it.
Yeah. As a local history museum, we focus on, I mentioned, where our mission is talking about the stories of Champaign County and surrounding East Central Illinois. So maybe those undertold stories that don't get as much attention as, say, an Abraham Lincoln or, a Stephen Douglas, but these stories of ordinary people who walk these same streets right around Champaign County or Springfield, Illinois, had such an impact, on our history as well. So it's important for their stories to be told too. So
right.
I appreciate that. Again, the viewers out there, I haven't seen any questions come in yet, but again, we're encouraging you to be a part of the conversation. We're having a good conversation here. Would love to have you send in some questions. So write those down below in the comment section. So talking more about memorials and monuments, just opening it up to everyone here. This is such a big issue, right now. And we've touched on this a little bit already, but how did we get here to this, this contentious topic of discussing about, memorials and monuments and memorializing, figures from history and the removal of some and the putting up of new statues and memorials. Why do you all think that this discussion has become so significant in our present time?
Well, I think one thing that's probably worth noting is that it's not necessarily specific to our current time, that memorials and monuments are things that are contentious at many different times.
Sure.
As part of my introduction to three-dimensional design class, I always have my students looking at a documentary about Maya Lin, about the creation of the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial, which was very contentious in its creation for a variety of reasons. People saw it as a black gash of shame or something until they actually walked into it and experienced it firsthand, and over time realized that it had an incredible value in its form. But for a variety of reasons, people were very against even the creation of that. The idea of putting everybody's names there sort of seemed sort of awkward or uncomfortable or painful or a variety of other things, right? That I think that memorials and monuments, because memorials are based on memory. First of all, people have the human memory is really bad. People have a lot of different versions of the memory, right? And that firsthand memory is not actually the best source in a lot of ways, because people remember things differently, right? They remember things personally. So memories, I think, are not necessarily going to be considered, are not always going to have that common ground. But I think that obviously as we were coming into the year 2020, there was an exceptional uprising of grassroots efforts to try to make radical changes in our historical landscape relative to monuments and memorials. But I think that it is important to note that it isn't strictly a contemporary consideration.
Sure.
I think part of the reason as well is that history pervades any society, because every society has a history. All people have a history. And a lot of times that history is latent, that you don't need to explore it, that there's no push to do so. But for societies, as for individuals, sometimes that's very difficult. So we're very familiar with that with individuals. If they go through a trauma, we usually think of this in psychological terms, but they have to cope somehow, right? They have to learn to process that trauma, whatever it is, in order to move forward functionally. And that's really wrestling with their past at that point, right? That's a part of their history that's not latent anymore. Like it reared up and assaulted them, and they have to live with that. And then their future is different and their present is different because of that problem. And so I think on a societal level, we're seeing an episode of that. It doesn't happen all the time, but we essentially saw history kind of surge up and become very visible, at least an aspect of it, right? Most aspects of history are never visible. Even the moments of latency, moments where you leave latency, you're only seeing the portion that suddenly seems particularly relevant. So I think that's a lot of what's going on, is that there was this fusion of the past and the present in people's minds, where normally most people don't live in that sphere. I mean, I as a historian do live to a greater degree in that sphere than most people. But that's not normal, I think, for the most part. So I think that's a very big reason. And I don't know when it will sort of calm down. I think at some point it will, but it's hard to know exactly when. Just this morning, I read an article about Hastings Law School in San Francisco, which was a law school I might have gone to. I decided to go to history graduate school instead of law school. I was from California. That was the top law school right next to where I live. So it's very likely I might have gone there if I hadn't come to graduate school. And the article today was, well, Serrano Hastings was implicated in Native Indian massacres in California. And he gave $100,000 of money for the first college of law in California and said, well, it has to always be named after me. So suddenly it's become a pressing issue in the last 4 years. Actually, it's not just been the last 2 years, but over 4 years, it's become debated. And it's just like the issues of African-American history and slavery. It's suddenly a big question for that institution.
I agree with very much with the points that both of you made. And we'll just also add in the small point that Nathan brought up earlier when he said that history is often about power. It's told from the people of power. And I think that is part of how we've reached this point. A lot of people who feel that they don't have that power are pushing back against those who do. And part of that conversation is going to butt up against the power that's always been displayed. And that falls into the realm of the statues that are put up and what's being recognized. And I think I mentioned in the documentary at one point, Black history is so much harder to find than white history. So I can go to a museum and I can, visit the African American History Museum right here in town and see that. But I can also walk down the street and see, plenty of statues of people that look like you guys, but I don't really see any that look like me. So I think it's all a part of kind of the awakening that a lot of people are going through, and there's a lot of pushback against that power that's just been in place for so long. And oddly enough, statues just fall into that category and are on the table for discussion.
Well, I think you go all the way into the history of art, and statues and monuments are built by wealthy, powerful people. That's just the nature of how it's done. Every once in a while, and it's not never done, but every once in a while, like a group of people, like the grassroots, sort of come together and create some monument to their thing that they created. But through the long swaths of history, the most powerful and richest people build the biggest monuments. That's how it's generally done, which means that when we're looking at large monuments, because they're mostly just because they're expensive to build. I mean, they're complicated to build, they're expensive to build. They require, financing of some sort or another, which means that or they're done in honor of those folks, right? But at any rate, that it creates a phenomenon where you're more likely to remember those people that are wealthy and powerful than you are to remember those people who are not. And so therefore there is that correlation, you know what I mean? Whether it's intended or not, it's the nature of the beast, unfortunately.
Really appreciate all those perspectives and thoughts on this big question, this big topic that we're talking about tonight, and you see as one of the main subjects, main themes in the film. So those of you out there watching, it's going to be your last chance here. Ask questions, send in comments. I have one more here, but if you have any questions or comments, write those in down below. So kind of getting towards the end here in summary, Nathan and Graham as producers and directors of the film, and Sunshine as a contributor in the film, you're interviewed in the film. All three of you, what do you hope people take away from the film? What message do you hope people get from either the entirety of the film, or Sunshine, from your interview and your message in the film as well?
For me, the thing that I hope that people take away from this is that it is okay to have the conversation about what needs to change. I feel like so many people, when you try to have those conversations, it's, you can't change history. You're trying to change history. It's almost like they just want to shut it down. I really want people to realize that even if we don't come to an agreement, we can still have dialogue and understand. You can try to understand where I'm coming from. I can try to understand where you're coming from. And it's okay to change things. Just because something has always been that way, it has to continue to be that way. Our eyes are opening. We're getting clearer vision. The more we progress, we're learning. So as you learn and grow, if you're open to that, you should be able to look back and say, you know what, that isn't something that we should have been doing. It wasn't right. We didn't know it back then, possibly, but we do now. So let's take some corrective steps and, change things for the better of the community. That's really the most important thing to me that I think people can take away, whether they agree specifically with statue removal or not. I want people to realize that, we all should be continuing to learn and grow and opening our eyes and realizing, and trying to improve ourselves and no matter what age we are. So I hope that is a resonating thing that people get from this conversation.
Jumping off from Sunshine's point, I think that conversation is really obviously one of the central focuses of this. It's obviously, debate is one form of conversation, which is really important. That was the underpinning of this, this famous debate between these two people on a subject, Lincoln and Douglas. And then, of course, like even in those tumultuous times, or even in these turbulent times that we're in right now, by engaging in this act of trying to tell a story through conversation, or to try to collect to form an opinion through conversation. I had an opportunity to meet, dozens of really interesting people, yourself included, the folks on this in here. I've had an opportunity to meet dozens of really interesting people, that are interested in continuing the conversation, continuing the debate, continuing and actually genuinely appearing to be interested in, listening, talking, and then this is in like one of the most polarized time with the most craziest sort of politics that I've ever experienced in my life. But if you sort of pose a question and begin the conversation, it's really interesting to hear some of the things that come out of it.
Yeah, I agree with both of them. Maybe let me put a slightly different twist on it that I think is useful to contemplate. So the film that you see is the collected vision of Nathan and myself primarily. And the reason for that is that we got to edit it. So as you said, we had an hour and a half of Sunshine, and I don't know exactly how many minutes she's in there. Let's just say 8, something like that. And that was true for everybody. So we had many, many hours of filming for a week of production that you knocked down to 45 minutes. And that means that we had a lot of power to present those people in ways that we chose and they didn't. And some of them, by the way, were very afraid of this. Even before the film changed, at the very beginning of the film, when I was trying to recruit the actors, I never imagined they would be worried about the film, but they were, because their decision of whether to work with us depended on, to some degree, their prior experience with other filmmakers, other people that wanted to use their services. And if they had been burned in the past, and there had been one very bad experience that Lincoln reenactors had had with someone in the past, then they didn't want to make themselves vulnerable to that, because it only takes one time to learn that that guy gets to make me look how he wants me to look. I don't decide how this gets edited. So that was a concern. Even, forget even the potential politics of Stephen Douglas, which kind of came later. That wasn't the plan when I was recruiting them. They were just worried going and being filmed. And I think that's a legitimate worry, because you don't have a whole lot of control about how your footage is going to be used. And the interesting thing is that Nathan and I could have made everyone in the film look very hostile to one another. Really, it would not have been difficult in the slightest. We could have made this film kind of be an echo chamber for what contemporary politics is like. We could have had, the most conservative statements of our white reenactors and Sunshine's most radical statements, and you clip those together and it looks like, oh boy, right here is the fight. And we really didn't want to do that. And I told that to people. I told that to Sunshine. I told that to other people, that we were trying to respect the various positions and to put them into conversation so that the viewer perceived a conversation. And to some extent, of course, with any product, it's fashioned. So would that be the exact same conversation if we put them all in a group for 2 hours and filmed the 2 hours? Probably not. Who knows how that would have gone, right? Same people, same ideas, but that process would have produced something else. And especially if you just didn't edit that and just stuck it up, on the internet, that would be a very different experience than what we produced, I think. So to my mind, one of the interesting things about the process is our own responsibility for trying to shape public discourse in a productive, constructive way, so that we're not demonizing other people. We're not trying to tear them down. We're trying to seek solutions. In our case, right, not political solutions. That wasn't our role. But to put something in the public domain that elicits discussion and questioning and thinking, and definitely not demonization, that opens up people saying, okay, he's a Lincoln reenactor, but that's an interesting point of view. And that's a Black Lives Matter activist, but that's interesting perspective there. And so I would hope that happens. But even more, I would hope that we as a people try and start being constructive and creating things, because the more I've worked with Nathan, I've kind of, the word creation, which didn't mean a whole lot to me as a scholar, was not a word I'd have associated with myself, even though I wrote things. It's become clear to me that we can make things, but a lot of what we do is making. How we fashion our institutions where we work and how we shape the departments we're in. And a lot of that can be made depending on how we treat each other and the decisions we make about what we want to do. And we can also try and tear things down. And I've lived long enough to see both of those things. And so I've become more thoughtful about trying to be as constructive as I can be and tamping down those parts of me where, I might be cranky, because those are in all of us. But I think that our society is the same choice. And I think we're struggling with it, is my sense of civil discourse. We're struggling to contain the cranky side and to try and promote the productive side.
I really appreciate that. Yeah. Well, thank you, the three of you, for the conversation tonight. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the film. Appreciate you, joining us for this discussion and allowing us to stream it on our local public access channel here. And if folks didn't have an opportunity to see the film, Graham or Nathan, are there any other opportunities in the future for them to see it? Are you showing it at other places or having similar discussions to the one tonight, or putting it anywhere else that the public may be able to view it?
Well, there will be, I think, already this is our third discussion like this, and there will be 2 more discussions, although at academic conferences, the major ones in the field. So that'll be a lot of fun, but primarily that will be historians attending those, and those won't be screened or streamed. But I would say, if anyone is listening and wants it to be shown somewhere, by all means, let us know. That might be possible. And I would say we do have intentions at the Lincoln Center to just post it up there for free. We'll probably do that fairly soon. Just basically, it has to do with making some decisions about what our website's going to look like, because we've only been in operation for a short time. So there may be some bigger decisions about that before we just stick the film on there. But we do want this to be a public resource, freely accessible for teachers, especially, who might want to use it to promote discussion. So it will be available there. I can't give you an exact date.
Okay, cool. Well, good luck on the future presentations, at the conferences, and, really enjoyed it, and, look forward to seeing the next one, the next documentary, so.
And I want to thank you very much for inviting us. I really appreciate the opportunity to have the opportunity to talk to these folks again, just about the project, but also to answer your questions and to sort of be available for your audience.
Yeah. Appreciate you all joining us. Thank you very much, Sunshine, Nathan, Graham, for joining us tonight. Thanks to the viewers out there watching this. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the program, if you wouldn't mind, I'm throwing in the comments again a link to a short survey. Let us know what you thought about tonight's program. Let us know if there's anything you'd like us to do in the future in terms of programming or exhibits or anything else at the Museum of the Grand Prairie. But thank you to the three of you again. Thanks to the viewers, and until next time, I'm gonna end our broadcast tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.